Every summer, gardeners across the country pull tomatoes off the vine, with a spreading black rot on the bottom, throw them in the compost, and assume something went wrong with the weather, or the soil, or the variety they chose. The problem comes back the next season regardless of what they change, because they never found the actual cause. What blossom end rot actually is. Most gardeners treat blossom end rot like a disease, spraying fungicide or pulling plants entirely, when it has nothing to do with fungus or bacteria at all. Blossom end rot is a calcium transport failure. The plant has stopped moving calcium from the soil up through the stem and into the developing fruit, and the tissue at the blossom end collapses and turns black, because calcium is what holds plant cell walls together as they form. The calcium is almost always already present in your soil at adequate levels. The problem is that the plant has lost the ability to move it efficiently, and the reason behind that transport failure is almost always the same thing every single time it happens. What if your watering is the problem, not your soil like? Let me ask you something. What if your soil has plenty of calcium, and adding lime or calcium spray is solving a problem that doesn't exist, while the real cause of every rotted tomato you've ever grown is sitting right there in your watering routine? Calcium travels through a plant dissolved in water, pulled upward by the process of transpiration through the leaves, in a continuous flow from the roots all the way to the developing fruit at the end of the branch. When watering is inconsistent, when the soil dries out between waterings and then gets flooded again the following day, that flow stops and restarts repeatedly, and during every dry period the developing fruit at the far end of the calcium supply chain goes without long enough for cell walls to collapse. The rot appears on the outside of the fruit days after the internal damage already happened, which is why it always seems to show up without warning when conditions looked fine the week before. The $6 fix identified. The $6 fix is agricultural gypsum, a naturally occurring mineral made of calcium sulfate that has been worked into vegetable beds by Amish farmers across Pennsylvania and Ohio since before packaged fertilizers existed as retail products. Gypsum delivers calcium directly into the soil in a water-soluble form that plants can take up immediately, unlike agricultural lime, which delivers calcium slowly through a chemical reaction that takes weeks to fully process and often overshoots the pH level in the process. Gypsum also doesn't raise soil pH the way lime does, meaning it can be applied to beds where pH is already correct without pushing it too high and locking out other nutrients the plants need. A 5-pound bag of agricultural gypsum costs $5 to $7 at most farm supply stores and covers a standard raised bed or a 10-foot row completely, with enough left over for a second application mid-season when calcium demand peaks during heavy fruit set. The deep watering habit gypsum addresses calcium availability in the soil, but Amish gardeners across Indiana and Wisconsin understood that solving a calcium supply problem without also solving the water delivery problem only fixes half the issue, and the half that gets left unfixed is the one that causes the rot. Their watering practice, passed down through Pennsylvania Dutch communities from the 1700s forward, was deep and infrequent rather than light and frequent, soaking the soil 8 to 10 inches down once or twice a week rather than wetting the top 2 inches every day. Deep watering does two things for blossom end rot prevention that shallow daily watering never accomplishes. It keeps the lower soil profile consistently moist where the majority of feeder roots are concentrated, meaning calcium dissolved in soil water is always available at the root level, regardless of what surface conditions look like during hot afternoons. And it encourages roots to grow deeper into the soil, rather than staying in the shallow zone that dries out fastest in summer heat, building a root system that is naturally resistant to the moisture swings that trigger calcium transport failure in the first place, and that no amount of gypsum alone can prevent if the watering pattern keeps interrupting the flow. The mulch layer that changes everything. Now here's what makes gypsum and deep watering even more effective than either one alone. A 4 to 6 inch straw mulch layer laid directly over the soil surface around every tomato, pepper, and squash plant in the garden. Amish farms across Ohio and Pennsylvania have mulched their vegetable rows with straw every season since the 1800s. And while the original purpose was weed suppression, the soil moisture effect is what makes it specifically critical for blossom end rot prevention. A bare soil surface in full summer sun loses moisture to evaporation rapidly, drying out the top several inches within a day of watering, even when the deeper root zone is still adequately moist. And it's that surface drying that triggers the shallow roots near the top of the bed to experience moisture stress first. A 4 to 6 inch straw layer holds soil moisture for 3 to 5 days after watering, regardless of air temperature, eliminating the drying cycles between waterings that no amount of calcium in the soil can compensate for if the water carrying it to the roots keeps disappearing before the next watering. A bale of straw costs $4 to $6 and covers 3 standard tomato plants with enough left over to protect a row of peppers alongside them, replacing $20 to $30 worth of commercial moisture retention products that don't stabilize soil conditions as effectively across the full season. Let me ask you something most people never consider. Let me ask you something most people never consider. If you've been spraying calcium on tomato leaves every summer trying to stop blossom end rot, do you understand why it doesn't work and why the bottle keeps selling anyway? Foliar calcium sprays are one of the most heavily marketed blossom end rot products on store shelves, sold in bottles that cost $10 to $15, with instructions to spray directly on developing fruit and foliage as symptoms appear. The science of how calcium moves through a plant explains exactly why this approach fails, almost every time it's tried. Calcium is a non-mobile nutrient, meaning once it is deposited in plant tissue, it cannot be redistributed to other parts of the plant that need it. It can only reach new growth and developing fruit by traveling up through the roots in the continuous water flow from soil to leaf, which is the exact flow that inconsistent watering is disrupting. Spraying calcium on leaves deposits it in tissue that already has enough, while the fruit at the far end of the supply chain continues to go without. Amish gardeners never reached for a spray bottle because the tradition they inherited never separated the calcium problem from the water delivery problem, treating them as one connected issue with one connected solution: adequate calcium in the soil where the roots reach it, consistently moist soil to carry it upward, and a mulch layer to keep those conditions stable through the hottest and driest weeks of the growing season when the problem is most likely to appear. The crop-by-crop guide blossom end rot affects different crops at different growth stages, and applying gypsum and adjusting watering at the right moment for each plant is what makes the Amish approach consistently effective rather than hit or miss. Tomatoes are the most visible victim, and also the easiest to protect. Gypsum worked into the planting hole at transplant time, roughly a quarter cup per hole, puts calcium directly in the root zone from the first week of establishment, before the plant ever begins flowering or setting fruit. For peppers and eggplants, which are slower to show symptoms because they develop fruit later in the season, gypsum applied as a surface ring around each plant in early June covers the window when calcium demand increases as fruit begins forming. Summer squash and zucchini develop blossom end rot almost overnight during hot spells, with fruit going from healthy to rotted within 48 hours of a moisture disruption, making mulching the single most critical preventive step for these crops rather than gypsum, since squash roots are shallow and respond to surface moisture conditions faster than any other vegetable. Watermelon and pumpkins show blossom end rot most dramatically because their fruit is large and calcium demand during the final size expansion phase is enormous, making a combination of gypsum at planting, consistent deep watering through the heat of July and August, and a thick mulch layer under developing fruit the complete prevention system. A Cornell University calcium management trial from 2019 measured blossom end rot incidence dropping by over 80% in gypsum-treated plots with consistent mulching compared to untreated controls under identical weather conditions. Let me ask you something. What if every rotted tomato was preventable? Let me ask you something. What if every tomato you have ever lost to blossom end rot, every pepper that came off the vine black on the bottom, every zucchini that collapsed before it was 2 inches long, was preventable from the exact moment you put the transplant in the ground? The window to prevent blossom end rot isn't when the symptoms appear in July, it's in May when the planting hole is open and the gypsum can go in before the roots ever establish in calcium-poor conditions. By the time the first black spot shows on a developing tomato, the fruit that is already affected cannot be saved, and several more fruits on the same truss are already past the point where any intervention reaches them in time. The intervention has to happen underground before the problem surfaces above it. Amish gardeners in Lancaster County described this principle in practical terms that got passed from one generation to the next without the scientific vocabulary. Something along the lines of feeding the ground before you feed the plant, and the plant will feed itself. The soil work done in the planting hole in spring is the blossom end rot prevention, not the spray bottle pulled out in despair in July when the damage is already done. A gardener who loses 30 to 40% of their tomato crop to blossom end rot every summer isn't having bad luck. They are skipping a spring soil step that takes 5 minutes and costs under $1 per plant to complete. The fall prevention setup for next year. The most effective blossom end rot prevention doesn't happen in spring at planting time. It happens the previous fall when the season's beds are cleared and the next season's soil can be prepared without any time pressure or planting urgency pushing the process. Amish farmers across Pennsylvania and Ohio worked gypsum into cleared vegetable beds every October and November, letting the calcium dissolve slowly through fall and winter rainfall deep into the soil profile, so that by spring, planting it was evenly distributed through the entire root zone rather than concentrated only in the planting hole, where it was applied at transplant time. Fall gypsum application, at a rate of roughly 2 pounds per 10 square feet, worked lightly into the top 3 inches of cleared bed soil, provides a baseline calcium level across the entire bed that reduces blossom end rot incidence the following season, even in years with irregular summer rainfall and inconsistent watering. Combined with a heavy straw mulch layer laid over the cleared bed through winter to protect the soil structure and prevent calcium from leaching out through heavy winter rain, the fall preparation creates conditions where spring planting goes into soil that is already calcium ready and moisture stable before a single transplant touches the ground. A Penn State Extension soil fertility study from 2020 found that beds receiving fall gypsum application had measurably higher plant-available calcium levels at spring planting compared to beds where gypsum was applied only at transplant time, with significantly lower blossom end rot incidence across the following growing season under identical crop and weather conditions. 5 minutes of fall preparation eliminates a summer problem that costs gardeners dozens of tomatoes every single year. $6, 1 mineral, a watering habit, and a straw layer. That is the complete blossom end rot prevention system that Amish gardeners have followed for 2 centuries without losing a tomato to it. Gypsum in the planting hole delivers calcium where the roots live from the first week of establishment. Deep watering twice a week keeps the continuous water flow moving that carries calcium from the soil up to the developing fruit. Straw mulch holds the soil moisture stable through the dry spells that normally break that flow and trigger the rot within 48 hours. And fall application into cleared beds sets up the following season's calcium baseline before the calendar turns and planting pressure begins again. The spray bottle on the shelf at the garden center costs 3 times as much as the gypsum and solves nothing because it was never aimed at the right part of the problem to begin with. So here's the question. How many tomatoes did you lose to blossom end rot last summer? Drop a comment below and let us know. And while you're there, pick your team. Team Gypsum and Mulch if you're trying this complete setup this season, or Team Still Spraying if you haven't made the switch yet. If this video finally explained why blossom end rot keeps coming back no matter what you spray on the leaves, subscribe to The Amish Life for more forgotten methods, and share it with someone who pulls black-bottom tomatoes off the vine every single summer, wondering what they keep doing wrong.